Okay, so this is the podcast following the talk Honey, I Shrunk the Church, part of our John 10:10 Vision series. And today my guest is Justin Brierley, who you will probably know from the Unbelievable podcast, those who've been a fan of that for a while. But Justin has been really at the forefront of conversations of faith between people of faith and people of no faith, people from across the spectrum, how to disagree well, how to discuss things well, how to navigate, understand the times we're in. You've recently written a book, Justin. Do you want to tell us about that and what that project is?
Yes, certainly. I wrote a book, came out last year, called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And the subtitle kind of gives the thesis, Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. So it's basically a book very much looking at those conversations that I've hosted between Christians and atheists over many years, and the way in which the conversation changed from the sort of very dogmatic new atheist kind of era to a much more interesting conversation in the last few years with sometimes, yes, still secular intellectuals, but who are far more open to the value of Christianity. And I think this has gone in sort of along with a kind of general change in the atmosphere that I've noticed, where people are reconsidering Christianity in light of the, I think, the failure in a way of new atheism to deliver on its promises of a sort of secular utopia. And so that's been my sort of, project for the last year or so. It includes now a documentary podcast series of the same name, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And so that's sort of a deep dive into lots of different areas where I'm seeing this new conversation on God emerging in our culture.
That's great. And I mean, it's probably worth just pausing briefly at the beginning to just go, define secularism. When we talk about secularism, what do we mean by that? What is the thing we're talking about?
Yeah. I suppose I'm using it not in its technical sense, which would be something like just the a sort of non-partisan way of doing government, that doesn't depend on any particular religious tradition. But I'm using it more in the sense that people tend to use it just to mean a post-Christian, non-Christian society, which has by and large rejected the claims of Christian faith, and sort of operates on essentially a kind of any atheistic understanding of the world and the universe. So that's the shorthand that I'm using secular for in this case. And
do you see you talk about kind of people getting to the end of that and kind of going, oh, it's not delivered on what we hoped for. I guess do you think what we're seeing is a little bit of a rebound to that? I think about I guess atheists like Ayaan, Hirsi, like saying, I just, a world without faith, without purpose. What's the meaning? Why are we here? I just couldn't find peace in that, or contentment in that, or purpose in that. Even a shift, I guess, in towards how would you describe it? Cultural Christianity, maybe, from people like Richard Dawkins, who finally, having kind of said faith has nothing good to offer and is the root of so many of the world's problems for so many decades, is finally going, well, I do recognize that actually my moral basis comes from a Christian basis. Do you think effectively, like, secularism got to the end of itself and was found wanting, and now people are kind of rebounding back?
I think that's certainly a good way of putting it. I think that, yes, essentially secularism, as I say, in this kind of experiment of trying to live at least in a sort of post-Christian world in which God doesn't apply, basically, I think that has been tried and found wanting. And I think it was very interesting. You mentioned Ayaan Hirsi, who's a very well-known, was probably the most famous female atheist in the world, who had this very surprising conversion to Christianity just the end of last year. And in an onstage conversation with Richard Dawkins, who, as you say, has also been talking in more sympathetic terms, at least about the cultural value of Christianity, she talked about the fact that she doesn't feel like she got to the end of feeling like the secular atheist kind of worldview, it just didn't have enough to it to give people a reason to live. And it didn't give her enough of a reason to live. That was partly why she kind of reached this kind of crisis moment in her own life that led her to convert. But also she just sees that it doesn't have enough to give people a better story than fundamentalist Islam, or, you know, the woke ideologies that she's worried about, or, you know, other kind of big powers like China or Russia or whatever. She just feels it's too shallow, and and I think what she's come to believe, you know, she's sort of been converted in many ways by Tom Holland, his sort of dominion thesis, that in the end it's a hollowed out form of Christianity anyway, secular humanism. And so she's kind of thrown her lot in with Christianity and said, I think the only way we're going to stand up to these other alternative worldviews is actually by stepping into a story that actually gave us these values and so on to start with. Richard Dawkins' response to this was, look, if you want to kind of face off against these things, you don't have to become a Christian. Just keep banging the secular humanist sort of drum. And she said, but it hasn't worked. And he said, well, just bang it harder then. You know, it was like, that was literally his answer. But I think my sympathies are obviously with Ayaan Hirsi Ali here, because I think we've tried that. You know, we're well into this secular humanist project. And as far as I can see, we're losing a lot of the things we had in our culture. It's falling apart in many ways. With the culture wars are ripping us apart at one level. There's the more technology we put in, the less happy we seem to be. Rates of depression, the mental health crisis, those are all skyrocketing among young people. For some reason, you know, 3/4 of suicides are men. There's a lot going on. And in theory, you know, the predictions were all, the more that we just do science, reason, and kind of this secular humanist thinking, the more we'll kind of move towards this utopia. That was the promise, and it hasn't worked out, basically. So that's why I think people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali and many others are kind of basically saying, well, let's try something else, and let's see whether this old story, the Christian story, might have something in it after all, even though many people like Dawkins have obviously tried their best to sort of get rid of it.
Yeah. And there's a few questions. I mean, we do see this shift going on around us. We do see this fragmentation. You know, I think it was Brené Brown, wasn't it, that said we're the most advanced, we're the most connected, we're the most developed society in history, and yet we're the most addicted, we're the most lonely, we're the most stressed, depressed, and you know, we're the most connected than ever. We're also the most disconnected in all sorts of ways. And so there's that situation going on around it. I referenced in my talk on Sunday, I'd heard a statistic recently that said that societies where there's the greatest gap between rich and poor see the lowest life expectancy levels. But interestingly, not just amongst the poor, but also amongst the rich. Our life expectancy drops the bigger the gap between the rich and poor, as well as mental health issues, as well as it's just, you know, something's fundamentally fracturing in our society. We're seeing these issues everywhere. And you've referenced that Ayaan Hirsi Ali there has kind of gone, well, that maybe this is the way to resist the tide of fragmentation that we're seeing, or the issues or the rise of, she would refer to as wokeism or whatever. Whereas Tom Holland might be, in my experience, you know him much better than I do, there's actually a bit more around mystery and wonder around some of his journey. Is that fair to say? So on one level, some of this shift among some of the people talking about might be an ideological shift, and go, well, actually Christianity can fit my ideology. Whereas, which my suspicion you might still just find yourself missing the mark if you taking Christianity up as an ideology. Where's the spiritual reawakening? That we would hope to see.
I think you're right that obviously the way Ayaan Hirsi as a public figure tends to go in is with more of a kind of political sort of flavor, and she's an activist in that sense, pushing for, you know, a more conservative sort of way of looking at the world and everything else. And now I think she's found a new kind of meaning for that in this Christian faith that she's embraced, and she's sort of seen how her values actually are shaped. Now at that level, she and Tom Holland are kind of in sync. You know, she does specifically say Tom Holland it was his reading his book that kind of made me realize actually that I'd been barking up the wrong tree all this time, trying to kind of see secular humanism as the answer. I think the difference is, as you say, Tom Holland, you know, he's really just approaching it as a historian. He's kind of pointing it out that the West is, you know, built on the Christian story. And I think he does sort of have concerns, some concerns at a political, cultural level about what happens in the absence of that narrative, and how you can hold on to it. But he's not an activist in the way that Ayaan Hirsi is, who maybe is looking for political solutions to this. And you may or may not agree with her approach on that, of course. In a funny way, yes, I'd say Tom Holland has also been going on a spiritual journey, which is absolutely, I think, about mystery and awe and wonder, and just kind of something that transcends a purely intellectual journey. To be honest, I think that's also just true of Ayaan Hirsi. I think she's still putting the pieces together from an experience she's had. And it sounds from the conversations I've heard her talk about this as though she had an experience, you know, where suddenly when she did open herself to prayer and to God, suddenly something happened internally. And to that extent, again, there's not, you know, there's overlap between their stories actually. And I think with Tom Holland, he's a little bit, you know, more coy about going into too much detail about his own spiritual journey. But what I've certainly what he's opened up to me in some of the public conversations we've had is basically that just as he's been attracted to the sort of intellectual side of Christianity, as the more he, you know, read the church fathers and examined the history, he kind of got intoxicated almost by this way of looking at the world. He just struggled to believe it, you know. But it was far more interesting, he said, than a sort of secular humanist version of reality. But then in the process of doing that, he started going to church, and he started, you know, sort of opening himself up to just being in environments. And I think what ultimately, if anything, brings him across the line to kind of spiritual faith, if you like, it's less a kind of philosophical arguments for God or, you know, historical arguments for the resurrection or anything like that. I've tried some of those on him and he's not particularly moved by them. He's far more just at an aesthetic, emotional level. Something resonates with him when he's in choral evensong at St Bartholomew the Great, London's oldest church, where he goes. He feels like it could be true in that moment. He feels like, yes, that somehow something breaks through the sort of the intellectual firewall that he struggles to kind of other times to overcome. So and he's had in my last conversation with him, he also was quite candid about, and it's a couple of interesting experiences, including a sort of cancer diagnosis he had, which he says he's almost willing to believe there was a kind of miraculous outcome for a couple of years ago. So he's I can't speak exactly at a personal level, but he's definitely going on a journey, as we like to say in Christianese. So.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And I mean, you've titled your recent book Surprising Rebirth. How surprised were you, like, when you started noticing this shift emerging? Did it take you by surprise?
Yes and no, because I suppose I shouldn't be surprised as a Christian. If I have faith in God, I obviously believe that, you know, that there will always be some kind of renewal and rebirth. You know, that's the way God has always operated. But looking at it from a purely sort of natural point of view, if you'd asked me 15 or 20 years ago when I started the Unbelievable Show in the heyday of New Atheism, I would have been surprised to hear that Ayaan Hirsi is converted. I mean, she was like absolutely part of the New Atheist speaking circuit, so that would have been very surprising. Like if you told me then, oh, you see that person speaking next to Sam Harris in 20 years time, she's going to be a Christian. I would have been surprised that all of the people who were at that time turning up for Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins in great numbers, the same demographic would be turning up for some guy called Jordan Peterson giving 3-hour lectures on the book of Genesis, like 10 or 15 years later. That kind of thing, like I wasn't expecting there to be a shift in that kind of way. But it has happened. I have seen and a lot of it is because, there's all kinds of factors that go into that. But partly it's just because I think the New Atheism itself just ran out of steam. In some ways that didn't answer those existential questions in the end that people had, and kind of suffered a sort of internal meltdown as well, which I go into some detail in the book and podcast series. So I think, so in that sense, I am surprised. It's an interesting, encouraging often surprise, but there's lots of aspects of this movement that I'm kind of not sure where they're going. I'm not completely comfortable with the political aspects sometimes of some of the folk who are, feel it, talking in far more sympathetic terms about Christianity. So sorting through the wheat and the tares, as it were, is part of what I'm trying to do as I kind of see this thing happen. And
I think it's part, the conversations you're in and the things you're talking about are all part of maybe a bigger picture that we're seeing this shift, aren't we, towards an open and greater openness, particularly amongst Generation Z, like younger generations, greater openness towards spirituality, greater inclination to pray, maybe not, adopt or identify as Christian or necessarily, but a greater openness to spirituality, and that shift towards there definitely seems to be a trajectory of people being more open to the spiritual, more open to that. There has to be more than we just see going on here, or we need something that feels authentic. We need something that feels like it makes sense of the world around me, which doesn't make a lot of sense to the world around us. I'm interested in, on one level we could look at this and go, oh, this is all really very encouraging for the church. That all these people who are finally realizing we were right all the time, like how affirming for us to see this, and very easy for us to adopt that position, I guess. I wonder actually if there's some reflecting for us to do as a church as well, though. Like, where have we, in our response to secularism, actually adopted a form of secularism? I wonder whether our response to how I would define secularism as the reducing of everything to what can I measure, what can I see, what can I evidence, what can I define. Maybe the church's response to that has been a shift, a resistance to it, a resistance towards push towards various political shifts. But the church's response has maybe been to dig in and go harder on certainty, harder on legalism, harder on literalism. Well, it says it in the Bible, so it's true. Like, I almost bibliolatry going on. Is that a fair observation or critique, or
I think I would definitely resonate with that. I think it's been going for a long time, actually. The sort of the Enlightenment and its kind of focus on reason and science and everything else also came with the Protestant era, and that sort of sent people back, in important ways, to the Word and to Scripture, and to sort of applying reason at that level to the Bible. And the sermon, became the central part of the service rather than the liturgy or the sacrament. And but the problem, of course, is that as you say, it's sort of the church very often mirroring back to what's going on in the wider culture, the Enlightenment sort of values on thinking, using the brain basically to work it all out, kind of has become, in lots of ways, the modus operandi of lots of parts of the church subsequently. And the problem is, that you're missing out on a whole aspect of what it is to be human if you only concentrate on that. So for me, bringing it up to more modern times, the new atheism was kind of Enlightenment on steroids kind of thing. It was, we're going to demolish religion and show you that it's all about science and reason, and everything can be explained through this naturalistic framework. And again, the church, I think, did something important, and I was very much part of that movement, still am in many ways, which is it sort of forced the church, as all these big atheists came on the scene, to kind of pick up its apologetics and theology books again and start to kind of come up with good arguments. And you had the rise of some very significant, online global apologetics, like William Lane Craig and so on, who came with very sort of systematic, logical arguments for God and for Christianity and the resurrection. And I was, moderating a lot of those debates in the early years of Unbelievable between the new atheists and the Christian apologists. And I was very kind of taken by it myself. And I still think there is an important place for that kind of rational argument. But I also came to see over time that there's only a very small kind of niche, actually, ultimately, of people who will basically get converted by that. In fact, it's almost non-existent, the ones that will just get converted on the basis of an intellectual argument. There's a huge component to coming to faith, which is about the heart as well as the head, obviously. And I increasingly came to feel like, as I say, as that new atheist sort of vibe has waned in the last several years, sometimes the church keeps trying to do the apologetics thing as though that's going to be the answer for the whole of culture. Now, it might have been a good response to the kinds of questions the new atheists were asking, but it's not necessarily actually a very good response to the kinds of questions Gen Z are now asking, which are not at all the new atheist kind of questions. The questions Gen Z are asking are about identity and purpose and meaning, and these sort of, and that's where, like, the Jordan Petersons and so on have kind of stole a march on the new atheists and started talking in very different terms and drawing these large audiences. And so I think the church needs to understand that we need to, that was perhaps good and important for a season, but don't assume that that's the questions people are asking now are the same as they were 10 or 15 years ago. The way I've been talking about this is that actually the best apologists out there, people like C.S. Lewis, were always actually brilliant at not only delivering that kind of traditional apologetics, but actually just inspiring the imagination as well. And so Lewis began his sort of Christian writing career, writing classic, apologetics works like Mere Christianity and The Problem of Pain, but he ended it writing the Chronicles of Narnia. And in many ways, those were far more powerful introductions to Christianity than any of his, formal apologetics works, because they made people want this to be true. That's literally kind of what he says in the book, when Lucy doesn't want to go back to the normal world, Aslan says, you'll have to learn to know me there by another name. And I think what he was giving was people permission to embrace this world of fantasy and talking animals and wise, majestic, but not tame lion Aslan. And then sort of saying to them, well, what if this actually existed in real life? What if the thing that your heart longs for in this actually does exist? And I discovered last year a great quote by Blaise Pascal, sort of 16th century mathematician and sort of polymath, who wrote many kind of works of apologetics. But this quote says, "Make good men wish that religion were true, then show them that it is." And I think that's the order you actually have to do it in.
Right. Yeah.
You have to make people wish that it were true. And then their eyes and ears and heart might be open to receiving that kind of, those arguments that you think are so good at proving it. And I've just found that always to be the case in apologetics. I've never seen anyone persuaded in the end by Christian apologetics who didn't want it to be true ultimately, because you can always offer another objection. If you don't want it to be true, there's no argument that's going to force you to believe it. You can always come up with another objection. You kind of have to want what's on offer at the end of the road. So for me, that's where I think that's the primary task of the evangelist, to make people wish that it were true. And then you might bring in the apologists if people have to sort through some intellectual stuff to kind of get there in the end, you know.
And I think, you know, you touched there on imagination, which is really interesting for me. I think sometimes, I think probably in our resistance and our sort of secularizing of the church in some ways that we've talked about, then you numb that awe and wonder and mystery, the spirit at the center. You know, I think it's really interesting that in my work within Jesus Collective, we do a lot of work around polarization. And on one end, you've got the kind of churches who are kind of pushing the boundaries on liberal, affirming, like everything's fine. And actually, there can be a tendency in those churches to diminish the spirit. Sometimes because it's like, oh, well, you know, that's people got damaged by conversion prayer or those sorts of things, and there's a caution, there's a sensitivity, there's nervous around it, but it results in a diminishing of the spirit. But then also on the evangelical conservative side, there seems to be diminishing of the spirit too, because we can't quite control it. So let's root ourselves in scripture, that's, you know, God is absolute, unchanging, all those sorts of things. And on either end there's this diminishing of the spirit, but the spirit reveals Jesus right at the center. And I think when we numb the spirit, we numb the imagination. And sometimes when we talk about using imagination in our prayer life, when we talk about engaging in imagination in how we teach or how we study or how we worship or how we pray, that can be met with some suspicion or wariness of going, well, hold on a minute, like don't trust your own imagination on this stuff. But I think that you know, language at its best transcends the definitions of the words, right? Language, when we just use language to define and confine, we don't use language to its full. You know, the great poets, the great lyricists, the great writers, when they write, they enable us to touch the divine that kind of transcends beyond. They help us transcend the capacity of the words themselves and take us somewhere else. Music does the same. Art does the same. I think it's why art and music and language and liturgy has been part of the so much of our encountering the mystery and the wonder and the awe. And I think I just wonder whether the church has lost the art of imagination.
Yeah.
And I wonder what your reflections are on that and how might we rediscover it?
Yes. I mean, I think we're going to spend the whole podcast furiously agreeing with each other here, but basically I agree with everything you just said. And I think the spirit is a really important part of this. As you say, the spirit is, I say, the spirit at some level kind of works through our imagination, even, whenever you're seeing the spirit move in scripture, it's through dreams and visions and through, and often through art as well. The spirit inspires the craftsman, building the ark of the tent of the covenant and all of those things. There's a kind of sense in which the spirit is this sort of, you can't put it in a bottle, basically, sort of thing. And I think, I was just sort of dwelling on you saying about the way in which the spirit kind of gets squeezed out of both the progressive and the very conservative ends of the church, because I think both in their own way, I think they are, you're right, kind of scared of what happens, because in different ways, at both ends of that spectrum, you're sort of turning the church into something that's more political, if you like, a kind of a set of things that, and both sides will have their in and out groups, but somehow Jesus always transcends that stuff.
Right.
And he will annoy a conservative evangelical and annoy a progressive liberal Christian because he doesn't fit in the boxes. And I think that's because the spirit is sort of happening all around him, and it's confounding everyone, you know, in his culture as well, who fitted into those two sort of boxes of his time. And I think that's the adventure of Christianity. And it's not easy because we like to kind of fit everything into our box, whether it be on the left and the right. But inevitably, humans are far more complicated than that. And I just find it far more interesting following a Jesus who kind of seems to be able to, you know, tick off both camps and do stuff that sort of is out of the box in that way. It's interesting, sort of some of these people I'm meeting as I chart this sort of surprising rebirth kind of thing. It strikes me that there is a certain type of person who wants Christianity for its functional value, you know, because they want it to bring back order and the values and ideals that they cherish, you know, and, you know, but the problem with that, and I've talked about this, is that you're wanting the fruits, but you're not wanting the roots. You're not wanting the relationship and the spirit that birthed all this in the first place. And that's, as soon as you kind of get rid of that, it's a doomed project, because it's just another political idol that you're creating. It's just another sort of social, you know, thing. But then I've met some people who certainly have maybe been drawn to Christianity for perhaps those kinds of reasons, but when they've jumped in, it's kind of completely messed them up, and they can't just see it that way anymore, and they can't just see everything in the old sort of left-right categories that maybe they once did, and they just will refuse to be sort of limited in that way. I mean, someone I'm thinking of here is Martin Shaw, who's a really interesting character, storyteller, mythologist by background, who grew up in a Christian environment, but sort of spent a long time away from the faith and sort of in this very sort of esoteric kind of new agey kind of tradition, but then had this very dramatic conversion to Christianity only a few years ago, and has gone into the Orthodox Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church. But again, he's kind of, you know, he's critiquing various aspects of the culture, but he's got this beautiful sense in which he's completely kind of shattered all his categories, and he's now just and he's a bit of a mystic by nature. He's a storyteller. He's an imaginative type. But I just love the way he approaches the faith in this beautiful, very, it's all about Jesus kind of way, and just wanting to do the stuff that Jesus did, you know. So that's just, I guess, some random thoughts.
Yeah. No, I remember. What it looks like. I never did. You know, went through I never wanted to be a church leader, so I never did the whole like theology degree seminary thing. But I did go to Bible college for a year, and I remember one of my lecturers at Bible college saying, "God will continue to save people by means that you cannot approve of, but deal with it. It's His kingdom. It's not yours." Yeah. And it just stuck with me. It was a really beautiful thing. And I think one of the when you talk about that, either end. I think a few years ago now I went on sabbatical, and I was really exploring the whole same-sex marriage thing, and I went to some of the pioneering churches out in the US who were moving that way, you know, who were pioneering in that area, and just to listen and sit with people and hear their stories, and I really expected actually that I would come out of this kind of very much on absolutely, we're going to be an affirming church for running down this road. Like this is direction. It's my heart is that way. And but actually, when I came back from my sabbatical, I was like, you know what? Actually, I only really see churches moving the goalposts along the goal line, including a different group of people, but excluding a different group of people too. They've not actually made the goalposts any bigger. And I'm not really interested in a church that doesn't make the goalposts any bigger. For me, how do we extend the goalposts in both directions? And one of the things how do we create a context where the same-sex couple can share space with the conservative Christian, and they can disagree and love each other and encounter Jesus through each other and be disrupted by each other. I think it was Pete Rollins, I remember him once talking about God is not a projection. God's supposed to be a projectile. And too many times we just want it to be a projection of ourselves. And I was like, man, I think the more we can be disrupted by each other and see difference as a gift, there are aspects of Jesus I can encounter through you because you're different to me, that I couldn't experience or encounter without you in my journey. Then we start to see each other as a gift rather than a problem to be solved, or someone to be persuaded in a particular way. And the imagery we use as a church is a solar system. So we kind of talk, well, if you want to increase the gravitational field of a solar system, you make the sun at the center bigger. You don't make it smaller, you make it bigger. And if we want to increase the gravitational field of the church, then we make Jesus bigger at the center. And so we can hold the tension. And I think imagination is a key part of that, and learning to see each other well is a key part of that. I often talk about, if I ever find myself saying I can't understand how they could think that, then that's my failure of imagination. It's not their failure, it's my failure. Anyway, I need to move on. I just kept picking up a couple of points.
Yeah, no, I think those are all great ways of putting it. I know exactly what you mean. I think it's the easy option you see is to create a church where you just have, it is just this group and we all believe the same thing, and there's a kind of an element of comfort in that. The difficult thing is to do what actually the church is supposed to be, which is a lot of very different people who wouldn't normally get on, coming around, gathering around something that's much bigger than any of them, and that is messy, and that's the problem. But it feels like actually that's that close to what Christ envisioned, and I'd rather have the messy authenticity of that reality than a kind of all the straight tidy edges when you just exclude everyone who doesn't kind of sign up to your very specific way of looking at everything.
And I think you said before, I think the key to this is Jesus transcends. Like when we encounter Jesus in the right way, Jesus transcends our differences. Jesus transcends these areas of disagreement or whatever it might be. And I think rather than trying to have Jesus as the mascot for our campaign, surrendering to the lordship of Jesus, surrendering to, well, it's his kingdom, it's his church, like it's all his, like we allowing him to be the transcendent unifier of all of this, seems to me to be the aim. I don't think we've all nailed that. I don't think we've nailed that. But it seems to me to be the aim. So if you have any wisdom on how we allow Jesus to transcend, rather than contain him for our own ends, as we finish off, any encouragements for us as a church and how we pursue this journey of renewal, I'd invite those. Thoughts.
Well, it's going to be very obvious, really, but I think it is honestly to keep our eyes on Jesus. And whenever renewal movements of the past kind of go off track, if you like, that they sort of lose their initial, I think it's because we do get sidetracked by so many cultural concerns, political concerns, and everything else. And it's always the great danger of doing anything that becomes quote unquote successful is it can become a victim of its own success. And I often feel like the reason God doesn't often give us the revival or the renewal that we pray for so earnestly is because we're not ready for it. We're so still kind of captive to the way the world works, and we would immediately do terrible things with the if we had this massive influx of people and support and everything else, because that's human nature. So I often think it's a mercy actually that God doesn't always answer our prayers for revival, because we'd do such a phenomenally bad job of doing things. I think that we need to prepare our hearts, if we are genuinely seeking that kind of renewal, for just to absolutely focus on the way Jesus interacted with people and the government and the state, the apparatus of his time, because I see so many, it's still such a temptation in the US church, especially. I think we're seeing this, like a certain segment that absolutely is just saying, well, the only way we're going to get what we want is through political power and through doing it this way. Okay. And as I said, that kind of philosophy exists on both sides of the political spectrum, but it's for me, it's always going to be a disaster, when you do that. And I think the only way you can kind of give space genuinely for the Spirit to do something new is to refuse to be taken in by the idols. It's a very, and that may include like absolutely changing what the kind of social media that you imbibe just because that's what's always there, or the news channel that is always feeding you the same thing, or whatever it is. There's kind of steps you need to take to just put Jesus at the center and his words and teaching and life and the Spirit central. And it's so easy, I think, in our culture to get dragged off because there are so many voices that want to take you in this direction or that direction, often promising good Christian biblical things, but which just actually turn out to be something other than Jesus's agenda. So I whatever we can do just to just put Christ at the center, and that's has always been the best thing we can do. The church has always been tempted by politics and power and the culture around it, but I just feel like this is a time, especially when we need to kind of really get back to Christ.
Wow, that's such a gift. Thank you so much for your time. Just remind us again where people can catch up with you on your podcasts and your book, etc. Remind us again how, if people want to hear more from you.
Well, the big thing at the moment for me, as I say, is this Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. That's available as a book, as a podcast. If you're a podcast listener, if there's links to both of them from my website, that's justinbrierley.com.
Great. Thank you so much, Justin. Real gift. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your wisdom.
Thank you, Adam. Lovely to chat with you. Thanks so much.
All right.
So I'll stop that there. I'll send you the recording.
Thank you.